Alrighty, friends, welcome back to The Proof. Today, my guest is Dr. David Katz, a leading physician, nutrition researcher, and public health advocate. In a world full of diet wars, viral anecdotes, and endless headlines, David has built his career on helping people separate signal from noise. In this wide-sweeping conversation, we explore the common ground that all healthy diets share, the risks and nuances of ultra-processed foods, the role of supplements, and the bigger picture of how science can better translate into improved public health. Whether you're keto, plant-based, or somewhere in between, this episode will leave you with practical, evidence-based insights for eating well. Please enjoy. For those who perhaps didn't catch our last episode or may not be familiar with your background, can you quickly remind us of your qualifications and how you've spent your career in nutrition medicine and public health education?
Sequential residencies in internal medicine, preventive medicine, public health. And my career-long focus has been on the prevention of chronic diseases, and in particular, leveraging the power of diet, nutrition, and lifestyle to prevent chronic disease in adults and children alike. And I've done that across the expanse of what I typically refer to as the academic physician's triathlon of teaching, research, patient care. So did a lot of teaching at the Yale Schools of Medicine and Public Health for many years, saw patients for 30 years, and founded the Yale Prevention Research Center, which I directed for over 20 years, where we did clinical research, both randomized controlled trials and community level intervention projects where we are testing our ability to essentially take what we know and turn it into good in the real world, which is really the sticking point for so much of prevention research. It's not that we don't know how to make things work in the context of a randomized controlled trial. We just have a really hard time translating it to real world applications. So I've been focused on that. When I started my training, lifestyle medicine did not exist as a discipline. If it did, I probably would have been credentialed in that rather than preventive medicine, because that was really my preferential focus within preventive medicine. And I'm a past president of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. And then I'm an accidental entrepreneur. I've invented a number of things. I have a number of patents, and my most recent and I think most significant invention is a whole new way to assess dietary intake instantaneously, effortlessly, and scalably, with the potential to turn diet and diet quality into a vital sign as ubiquitous as blood pressure. So that's been my particular focus over recent years.
Our lifestyles are pretty complex. Based on all of your research over the years, how significant would you say is the role of nutrition in today's chronic disease numbers that we see and I guess the public health here in America?
It would be really difficult to overstate the influence of nutrition. Let's start, Simon, with why, so that this doesn't feel surprising to people. Food is the fuel that runs every aspect of the extraordinary human machine. And if you think about fuel in the tank of any machine, obviously the performance of the machine is highly dependent on the quality of the fuel. So that just makes sense. So there's that relationship, and that immediately starts to suggest that the quality of diet, which is our fuel, would be relevant to every function the extraordinary and massively complicated human machine has to perform. But there's more, because we're not just running on food, we're also manufacturing ourselves out of food. Now that's particularly vivid when you think about a growing child. You see a child one year and you see that same child the next year, and they've grown this much. Where did that extra Jill or Johnny come from? Well, it came from food and nowhere else. We literally are what we eat. It's not a direct translation. You don't eat French fries and turn into French fries, but you extract the nutrients from what you eat. Those become raw materials in the construction project of building the growing body of a child. And that growth comes directly from food. In the case of an adult, we're reconstituting ourselves on a regular basis, turning over hundreds of millions of cells, replacing spent hormones and enzymes. So food is both our fuel and our construction material. So it should then make sense that diet quality measured objectively is the single leading predictor variable for premature death from all causes in the United States today, and is the single leading predictor variable for the risk of all major chronic diseases. And what that means is if you get diet wrong, increased risk for all the bad stuff you don't want to have happen to you, a loss of years from life, a loss of life from years. And if you get diet right, it is the single most potent way to maximize years in life and life in years. It's not the only thing that matters, but it's number one in terms of influence on both premature death and chronic disease.
Let's double click on diet quality. What does that actually mean? If we were to define that based on all of the research, what does a high quality diet mean by definition?
And it has been defined. So I would say, Simon, a good place to start is that quality is as quality does. What would you want a high quality diet to do from you? And we're talking from the perspective of science, medicine, public health. So, we could argue that a high quality diet is a diet that tastes really good and that you enjoy eating. And I don't disagree with that, by the way. I mean, that one aspect of dietary quality is it's a diet that adds pleasure to your life. I think that's legitimate. Focusing on the scientific side of the equation, a high quality diet is as a high quality diet does. So it should defend you against the slings and arrows of outrageous epidemiologic misfortune. It should protect you against chronic disease. It should reduce your risk of obesity, diabetes, hypertension, coronary disease, cancer, all the rest. It should make you hale and healthy. It should make you vital and energetic. It should allow you to feel good throughout your days and sleep well at night. And it should do that for a very long time. So it's something that contributes to your longevity. So years in life, life in years, both fortified by a high quality diet. So that's the objective way of measuring it. And when I talk about diet quality, I'm not talking about my opinion. We're having a conversation, Simon. You asked me for my opinion on any topic, I'll share it with you, making it clear that my opinion is. But when we talk about diet quality, the best way to avoid both diatribe and diet tribe is to avoid opinion altogether and say there are objective measures of diet quality that look at the distribution of nutrients, making sure you get enough of the stuff we tend to get too little of, making sure you don't get too much of the stuff we tend to get too much of, making sure that you have an appropriate distribution of all of the foods that best support good health outcomes. Most importantly, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds. And you assemble all those contributions into an aggregate score, and you don't need to make that up, and I don't need to make that up because it's been done already. There are a number of these measures. The one that's most widely used and has been most extensively studied is something called the Healthy Eating Index. There are a number of variants on that particular theme, and this was developed by researchers at major universities in collaboration with the USDA. The current version of that is the Healthy Eating Index, or HEI 2020. And among other things, in large cohort studies, so we're talking 100,000 people or more followed for decades, as goes the HEI score, so goes mortality, so goes chronic disease. So higher scores, less mortality, less chronic disease, lower scores, more mortality, more chronic disease. That's diet quality. And so it's a combination of nutrients and servings of foods, all aggregated up to represent the best character of overall diet pattern as it correlates with the critical outcomes that matter most, mortality and morbidity. And when I talk about diet quality in my own work, we're using that objective measure. We didn't make it up. We derived it from a vast amount of peer-reviewed science, the Healthy Eating Index 2020. And the advantageous thing about thinking of diet quality that way, Simon, is it steers us clear of opinion and ideology. And I have my opinions and I have my personal ideology, and I'm happy to talk about those. But I think when we're doing science, we have to very faithfully differentiate between what we know and what we want, between what is science and what is our opinion. So whenever possible, I sidestep ideology altogether and say epidemiology should prevail over ideology, and we should elevate the science.
I think how you spoke to quality is really important because often I see a bit more of a reductionist kind of definitional use of the word quality, particularly when one is speaking to protein. And what I'm thinking here is that often you'll see an isolated protein source and the quality based on that single food's amino acid kind of profile and perhaps how that may affect a short term or outcome like muscle protein synthesis or even strength, but not also kind of encompassing the effect of that food on longer term health outcomes. And so it's important when we're using the word quality to define what are we talking about here? Are we talking about a single short term outcome, or are we talking about a kind of more holistic long term outcome?
And you could argue that both matter, at different stages in your life. I mean, you can imagine, for example, you're a competitive athlete. How you perform today matters a lot. But fortunately, the two are highly compatible for the most part, Simon. And with rare exception, most Americans get far more protein and far more of all of the essential amino acids than we need for minimal requirements. And there's some potential argument for more in athletes who are focused on strength in particular and muscle bulk, so competitive bodybuilders and weightlifters, so forth, may benefit from more. Most athletes focused on stamina probably don't derive a particular benefit from extra protein. But they do derive a real benefit from a rich infusion of antioxidants from a wide variety of plant foods, which favor muscle recovery. So you need the critical amount of protein, but that's by no means the only thing you need. And I'm not just talking about years in life and life in years. I'm talking about, winning Wimbledon today. I'm talking about performance today. Optimal nutrition in the short term and optimal nutrition in the long term are much more alike than different. We tend as a society to fall in and out of love with particular nutrients, and they become either silver bullet or scapegoat, and that's always been wrong. You mentioned reductionism, and I would agree with you. I'm avoiding that. I'm looking holistically at diet quality. But if I were to be reductionistic for a second and give you the one word thing we need to focus on to optimize diet quality, my one word would not be sugar or salt or fat or protein or carbohydrate. My one word would be balance. Because think about it, if you are Inuit and you're eating seal or whale, if you have a massive intake of omega-3, we've all heard that omega-3 fat is really good for us. Well, the Inuit don't need more. If anything, they get too much. Now, does that mean omega-3 has gone from being a good thing to a bad thing? No. It's just if you're getting massive amounts of it, more is not helpful to you. It's coals to Newcastle. If you tend to get too little, more moves you toward balance, and it's a good thing. So when you get more of what you tend to get too little of, it moves you toward balance. That's good. When you get more of what you already have too much of, it moves you further away from balance, and imbalance is bad. It's bad for physiology. It's bad for metabolism. When you get less of something you tend to eat in excess, that's a good thing. When you get less of something you're not getting enough of, that's a bad thing. And those conditions vary around the world. So there are absolutely places around the world prone to famine where there is widespread protein deficiency, and more protein is a critical consideration in diet quality there. Just doesn't happen to be true here, where we all get way more protein and way more of all the essential amino acids than we need. So protein tends not to be rate limiting here. The one word that I would defend as the best single representation of the critical essence of diet quality is balance. And that's because of adaptation. Our physiology needs what it needs. And to be clear, those adaptations vary by species, right? There are animals that can only thrive on a entirely plant exclusive diet, and there are obligate carnivores as well. They can't swap diets. They can't metabolize what the other can metabolize. We're in the middle. We are constitutional omnivores. We've got choices. But I'm just pointing out there's this ineluctable link between physiology, metabolism, adaptation, and dietary requirements. And what all of that points to is balance. Provide your metabolism, your physiology with what it needs, you will thrive. Give it anything other than what it's adapted to thrive on, and you will thrive less.
So if we were to get really practical for a moment here, what does balance look like, or achieving greater balance for, let's say, the average American who is going to step into the grocery store, is hearing this and thinking, I'd like to increase my healthy eating index score and be more adherent to that way of eating. So I'd like to eat less of the nutrients that I'm perhaps over-consuming and increase my intake of nutrients that I'm under-consuming or not consuming at all. And I'm interested in what that looks like from a food perspective for my family.
We tend to consume too much salt, mostly in the form of ultra-processed and highly processed food. Salt intake in America is excessive, and 80% of the salt we consume is not from a salt shaker. It's processed into food. So eating less processed food means less sodium. We tend to get an excess of saturated fat, some of the other unhealthy oils. A lot of that comes to us in processed foods as well. And we get way too much added sugar, and that's processed into just about everything.
I recently ran my full labs through Function Health, and I have to say the results were eye-opening. Turns out my ApoB was higher than ideal, probably thanks to a little too much coconut yogurt. I also found out I was slightly low in copper, something that I would have never suspected without testing. On the flip side, my biological age came back 13.3 years younger than my actual age, a calculation based on the work of aging researcher Dr. Morgan Levine. So all in all, I've got a few tweaks to make to optimize my lipids and nutrient status, but overall my blood work says I'm doing pretty well. That's what I love about Function. You get access to over 160 biomarkers covering everything from hormones and inflammation to nutrients, toxins, cardiovascular risk, and more. And all your results are housed in one beautiful platform, all tracked over time. Once you get your results, you can make informed changes before small issues become big ones. To get started, head to functionhealth.com/Simon Hill. The first 1,000 people get a $100 credit toward their membership. That's functionhealth.com/Simon Hill.
Yeah, and it's fortunately it's easy. Of course, Michael Pollan put it in 7 words, Simon: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And, essentially, if you translate that into a response to your question, what should I do to fix what's broken? So eat food instead of pseudo food. In other words, get away from ultra processed food where the ingredient list runs off the package, and eat more stuff that comes with an ingredient list that's just one word long, like almond, walnut, salmon, banana, broccoli, anything direct from nature. And emphasize plants, which would be fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds. And I would append to that, when you're thirsty, mostly drink plain water. So in the grocery store, spend more time in the produce aisle, buy some cooking grains, get some nuts and seeds, but basically steer clear of stuff that looks like it glows in the dark. Steer clear of stuff where the ingredient list runs off the package. The more stuff you can buy that doesn't come in a package, that would be a good thing too. But, frankly, some good stuff does come in a package, so that's not obligatory. Steel-cut oats come in a package, and dried lentils come in a package, and canned beans come in a package, chickpeas, all that's fine. So the package is not the problem per se. But short ingredient lists, ideally one word, and lots of plant foods. Again, this does pertain to that issue of balance, because if Americans were all vegan, and if we were not eating enough legumes, so, again, practically what this means for the typical American shopper is spend more time in the produce aisle and spend less time in those center aisles where everything comes in a bag, box, bottle, jar, can with an ingredient list running off the package. And the reason for this is we tend in America to eat a lot of meat, and we benefit from eating less meat and more plants. so more time in the produce aisle. We tend in America to eat a lot of ultra-processed foods, which have all sorts of liabilities I think we should spend a fair amount of time talking about. So the more things you buy that have an ingredient list just one word long, foods direct from nature, the better. So it really is all about balance. If we were all vegan and had a very rich intake of a wide variety of plant foods, then it might very well be the case that recommending more of that would not improve diet quality. We'd have to recommend something else. But we tend to get too little fruit in the typical American diet. We tend to get too little vegetable in the typical American diet. We tend preferentially to eat meat as our protein source rather than beans and other legumes. And they have all kinds of advantages. They don't have the saturated fat. They have a high quantity of fiber. We tend to consume too much salt, mostly in the form of ultra-processed and highly processed food. Worth noting, by the way, in passing, that salt intake in America is excessive, and 80% of the salt we consume is not from a salt shaker. It's processed into food. So eating less processed food means less sodium. We tend to get an excess of saturated fat, some of the other unhealthy oils. A lot of that comes to us in processed foods as well. And we get way too much added sugar, and that's processed into just about everything, into everything we eat, everything we drink. And again, if you shift to foods direct from nature, preferentially plants, you're avoiding all of that, reducing your intake of saturated fat, sodium, sugar. And it's not that any one of those is evil either. Saturated fat, there are a variety of different saturated fatty acids. They're not bad. In fact, they're a native part of our diet too. We just tend to get too much, and getting more of what you already have too much of, that's bad. That's imbalance. And sodium is an essential nutrient. As a physician, and I would imagine most of my colleagues at some point in their training or careers have seen this, I've seen hyponatremia. That's a low blood level of sodium. It's a devastating condition. It can be lethal. I've seen patients have seizures because of low blood sodium. It's an essential nutrient. So there's nothing evil about sodium. We must have enough of it. But we routinely get way too much of it, and that contributes to hypertension and strokes and heart attacks and kidney failure and so forth. So it's the excess that's harmful. So, again, balance is the key, and the means to that end for the typical American shopper would be buy less stuff with long ingredient lists and spend more time in the produce aisle.
And if we were to think of an example plate of food for dinner, this could look something like legumes, a couple types of legumes perhaps, plus or minus fatty fish like salmon, vegetables, some type of whole grain like brown rice or even white rice. Is that what we're kind of referring to here?
Well, there's a world of culinary options wrapped around this. So you think about the fact that some large populations are vegan or vegetarian and have been for generations in South Asia, for example, in India. So there are many different regional cuisines in India that are almost entirely vegetarian. Wide variety of dishes based on lentils and chickpeas and different vegetables, some of which are commonly eaten here and some of which are not. Okra. There are Southeast Asian cuisines, Japan, parts of China, other Southeast Asian countries that very heavily feature vegetarian and vegan cuisine. And then there are those variants all around the world. So yeah, you can do an awful lot of things with plant foods, and you can, as a flexitarian, include in the mix there some quantity of fish or seafood, which could be part of a meal or not, some quantity of eggs or dairy, which could be part of a meal or not, some quantity of poultry or other meats, although I do particularly recommend people minimize their intake of beef, and we can talk more about all the reasons why if you like. But lots and lots of options, and I can offer up some direct from the home front. My wife is French, grew up in southern France, brilliant cook. I've been a beneficiary my whole life of Catherine's brilliant cooking, as have our 5 children. And she decided to pay it forward. One of our kids urged her to do this, and she created a recipe website called Cuisinicity.com. So like Cuisine City, but with an I in the middle. Just the simplicity of beautiful family-friendly cooking, Cuisinicity.com, and it's freely available to everybody. And it's all her recipes, and it's videos showing you how she makes stuff. And she was a busy mom of 5 kids growing up when she developed these recipes. So they're incredibly nutritious, they're wonderfully delicious, but they're also not fancy. They're convenient and things that anybody can do at home. So help yourself if you're seeking inspiration. Hey, I like that idea of eating more plants or more beans, more legumes, but I don't know how to do it. Help yourself to that. But also think about just the richness of global cuisine. There are a lot of major cuisines that feature these different kinds of plant foods in various assemblies with or without the inclusion of animal foods, so that there's a whole world of culinary adventure out there for you if you want to expand your repertoire in this area. Lots and lots of different things we can do. But yeah, we really should be flipping the script. I think most Americans were sort of raised to think that the centerpiece of a meal is meat and everything else is secondary. For the sake of health, both in the short term and the long, and planetary health, which we frankly should be talking about too, is arguably the signature issue of our time, we should reverse that. And the centerpiece should be a variety of plant foods with or without the meat. And you don't need it at all, but if you are going to include it in your diet, it should play a secondary role.
Let's double click on your recommendation to specifically reduce intake of beef. Is that because of the connection with planetary health?
For me, it is. And it's also because of the ethics of how we treat animals to produce our food. And I think everybody's obligated to be aware of that. At this point, there are lots of different sources of information about the brutality of concentrated animal feeding organizations, CAFOs, and factory farming. And, so many of us have pets. We have cats or dogs. We have other mammals that are part of our families, other species that we love. They're not all that different from beef cattle. In my case, in addition to dogs, I have horses. They're a lot like cows in terms of how they perceive the world, and that's when I first encountered this issue. Was riding horses out west and seeing cattle who were being raised as food, and I thought, one of you is a dear friend, and one of you somebody's dinner. Kind of have a problem with that. My eyes were open to the true brutality of concentrated animal feeding organizations by John Robbins in his book, The Food Revolution. It kind of changed my perspective, and there was no going back. So you could argue the ethics of it, and I think that's very important. But yes, for me, I think the signature issue of our time is that this is the only planet we're ever going to share. And we are rapidly making it inhospitable to ourselves and the other creatures that have the misfortune of sharing this time with us. And one of the major contributions each of us can control when we sit down to eat is our intake of beef. When you compare the environmental footprint of beef to other foods, it's pretty much off the charts. You have to go to a logarithmic scale to put beef on the same chart as everything else. A huge amount of water utilization, a huge amount of land utilization, and in particular, a massive association with greenhouse gas emissions, so a direct contribution to climate change, which then in turn makes it harder to produce all the other foods we need to feed a global population of 8 billion plus. So the ethics of raising beef for human consumption, pretty questionable. And by the way, it doesn't have to be that way. I'm not saying it's unethical for humans to be omnivores. I'm saying that factory farming is unethical. It's brutal. It's cruel. And I don't think any decent person wants wanton cruelty on the menu. And this, by the way, is not just about beef, but also about pigs and poultry. So, just the terrible treatment of any fellow creature should trouble us. But then our excess intake of beef contributes to almost all the major chronic conditions that plague humans in America and in the modern world, and this outsized associated environmental footprint. So, these are the 3 critical windows I think we should look through when we weigh up our dietary choices. What are the direct effects on human health? How are we treating our fellow creatures? And what are the implications for planetary health? And you basically have 3 big X's for beef, which may not mean eat none, because if we all ate none or a lot less, then we would be producing a lot less. And we would be able to produce it in a way that is not as environmentally harmful and not as cruel to the animals, and lesser intake would still be consistent with human health. So again, it's not an all or none choice, but however much beef you're eating, if you're eating beef, think about eating less.
It's an interesting conversation because I think most people tend to agree with what you're putting forward there about CAFOs from an ethical perspective, and are of the view that it would be more ethical to raise these animals differently in different environments. Where I think it gets a little more debated is that there seems to be this message from people that it's not the cow, it's the how. And we can, in fact, double down on our meat consumption if we were to just shift to kind of more extensive regenerative farming type practices. But when I've at least double clicked on that, it seems that there still is significant planetary health issues there, particularly around land use, if the consumption of beef wasn't to decrease at the same time.
So a couple of comments there. First, when I have the expertise I need to answer a question, I'm not shy about saying so. When I don't, I turn to people who do. In this case, the person I rely on most is Guidon Echelle at Barnard College. I think he's one of the most knowledgeable people in the world about specific environmental impacts of animal husbandry, different forms of agriculture. He's written some quite scholarly papers on the exaggerated benefits of regenerative agriculture. Not that there isn't a there, but it actually tends to be less efficient in terms of mass of beef produced per unit, hectare, acre, space in the world than factory farming. The reason for factory farming is its incredible economic efficiency. It's good business. So that alternative argument, we can double down. We can even eat more beef. Well, yeah, but you're producing it now by means that require much larger swaths of land. And so you're taking over what could have been land used for other purposes, potentially available to wild animals, and turning it into pasture land, which, by the way, is what we're doing in the Amazon rainforest. We're burning down the Amazon rainforest to create pasture land, to raise cattle to satisfy the global demand for beef. So I think it's a complete misdirection. I think there's an argument about regenerative agriculture that's legitimate. But part of what allows regenerative agriculture to be part of a viable, sustainable world is that the total volume of beef consumption goes down, so you're not dependent on factory farming. So it's a reduction in volume, total beef consumption either way. And then I think regenerative agriculture can be part of that discussion.
This topic of animal versus plant foods, if you want to put it that way, continues to be hotly debated. And in 2019, I think it was, you debated Nina Teicholz on this very question: are vegetarians healthier than omnivores? Looking back from today's perspective, now 6 years down the road, how do you think that debate went?
Well, it wasn't pleasant, because I happened to be debating somebody who was focused more on attempted character assassination than content. But any well-structured debate has a resolution that you're debating, and the resolution that we were asked to debate was there is little or no evidence that there are benefits from plant-based diets. And I took the position that that resolution was false. And I presented a massive amount of evidence of the health benefits of plant-based diets, both vegetarian and vegan, and low animal food versions of flexitarian and so forth. Just went through a litany of randomized controlled trials. I said, it's just a fact. You can decide you don't like these studies. You can decide you wish they reached a different conclusion, but you can't pretend they don't exist. The resolution was there's little or no evidence. So I've just given you dozens of randomized controlled trials, to say nothing of the observational epidemiology. So objectively, I won the debate. There was a vote before and after, and I won. So I think it went fine. I think the truth prevailed. To me, it had nothing to do with who was debating whom. It was the topic. The topic won because the evidence is there. and refutation of the evidence does not make it go away. Those trials have been conducted, those papers have been published, and the evidence is really overwhelming. The other thing that I would note is that, from my point of view, the best evidence about the benefits of plant predominant diets extend beyond any one measure of human health and do look at biodiversity and do look at ethics. I think it is to the discredit of humans to engage in wanton cruelty toward other species. It's shameful. So I think that's relevant too. I think if we know that one dietary approach results in cruelty and abuse of other creatures and another dietary approach does not, that latter dietary approach is favored. I think the planetary implications are absolutely critical. What are we doing to aquifers? What are we doing to rainforests? What are we doing to biodiversity? Also critical. None of that was part of the debate. It was just that one lens, just about health. So even through that one lens, the answer was clear and the truth prevailed. So, in that sense, the debate went fine, but I don't think the debate covered the requisite terrain. I think we no longer have the luxury of asking questions about diet as if it didn't have implications for planetary health. Because once we run out of planet, we're all cooked. And debates about diet will be moot. We're going to have a hard enough time producing adequate quantities of food, to say nothing of the quality, once we've destroyed the hospitability of Earth for all the things we're used to growing and consuming. And we're headed in that direction with ever more drought and flood and unpredictability. So I think in many ways the debate was too constrained. I don't think we can unbundle human and planetary health. But I debated within the parameters I was given. And again, the truth prevailed because the volume of evidence available on this topic truly is quite overwhelming. And it's not because plants are good and animal foods are evil. In a world of hunter-gatherers where both are part of the mix and there's no cruelty there and there's enough to go around, we wouldn't be having such a debate. But we're talking about a world where we have concentrated animal feeding organizations and factory farming, and it's hard to get people to eat fruits and vegetables. And we tend not to grow a wide variety of fruits and vegetables. We have massive monocultures to feed beef and poultry and pigs so that we can eat them. So there's just these massive distortions in both food consumption and food production, leading to tremendous imbalances. And as has become thematic in this discussion, imbalance is bad.
Do you think that there was anything in that debate that you could have said or put forward that might have changed Nina's views?
No, I think her views are, first of all, I don't have any particular interest in talking about her, and my interest was not in changing her views. She came with an agenda. I think there's a famous aphorism that it's very hard to get somebody to understand a thing when their livelihood depends on them not understanding that thing. Right? There are different versions of that aphorism, but that's the gist of it, right? You're not going to get the aha moment when the person that you're trying to share the epiphany with has a vested interest in not believing that it's true. So, I think there are lots of people who built their careers about these extreme positions. I like to think I'm not one of them. So, I'm not radically in favor of any given dietary pattern. And what I do professionally applies an objective measure of diet quality across the spectrum, from low carb and paleo and keto all the way to vegan and everything in between. And I think we can meet everybody where they are. The simple fact is that in the modern world, we tend to eat too much meat, so eating less is a good thing for just about everybody. And we tend to eat too few fruits and vegetables, so eating more is a good thing for just about everybody. I mean, that's, again, we're fixing the imbalances. That's not ideology. But if you are ideological and you have this notion that there's something good and sanctified about meat consumption, you can't change your opinion about that because your whole career is predicated on defending that point of view. So all of your connections, all of your ties, everybody who backs you, the flow of revenue into your purse or wallet It's all tied to that. And I can think of others who are in that same position. And it isn't just about meat versus plants. There are other forms of ideology and nutrition. So, for example, there are all of these theories which I think are very much overcooked about obesity, and whether it's about calories and the energy balance theory, or whether it's about the carbohydrate insulin theory. And there are people who've chosen one of those as if they're mutually exclusive, which to me is silly. And sort of predicated their whole career on, we've been deceived about where obesity comes from and calories, and they can't change their point of view either, because their reputation, their career, their platform is that. So when you debate somebody, if they're genuinely interested in the truth, then potentially the debater, herself or himself, may change their mind. Otherwise, you're playing to the audience and just trying to share accurate information and letting the verdict come from an audience of your peers. But not all interlocutors can change their opinion, because they're deeply invested in the opinion that they've shared with the world. And so, no, I was not expecting that outcome.
Since that debate, despite there being, as you put it, a litany of evidence that supports these high fiber, plant rich dietary patterns, of which there are many that we could name, since that time, keto and carnivore diets, these meat heavy type diets, have continued to surge in popularity, at least on social media, with people sharing stories of overcoming obesity and diabetes, even autoimmune conditions, on these kind of very meat heavy diets. What do you make of this movement, these anecdotes, and the kind of evidence around these kind of meat heavy ways of eating for human health?
If you're going to fly the paleo flag, be honest about the fact that there was no Paleolithic pepperoni and there were no Paleolithic hot dogs, right? And so the paleoanthropologists who've done this work and made the comparison say, well, you want to think about the kind of meat humans are adapted to eat. Probably about the closest approximation in the modern world would be something like antelope. So let's look at the composition of the flesh of antelope. Well, the average beef cattle have about 35% of total calories in their flesh coming from fat, and most of that fat is saturated and none of it's omega-3. The average flesh of antelope, 7% of the calories come from fat, so 1/5 the fat content. Almost none of it's saturated, and quite a lot of it is omega-3. So, okay, it's meat, but it's night and it's day. Totally different.
I'm sure you've heard of Gymshark. It is one of the biggest fitness brands in the world today. And it all started in a teenager's garage. Yep, that's right. Ben Francis was 19 years old, printing shirts himself, and he built it all on Shopify. That's what I love most about Shopify. It gives everyday people the tools to turn an idea into something real. And if you align it with something that you believe adds value to the world, it won't feel like work at all. And I can tell you honestly, that's exactly how I feel about building 38 Terra with Dr. Will Bolsewitz, bringing a truly science-backed gut health product to life. Whether you're starting a supplement line, a sustainable clothing brand, or any kind of physical goods business, Shopify gives you everything you need. Beautiful storefronts, secure payments, and AI tools to help write product descriptions and generate discount codes. And their 24/7 support is actually very helpful. Shopify powers millions, and I mean millions, of businesses worldwide, including 38 Terras. If you've got a dream, allow Shopify to help bring it to life. Start your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/proof. That's shopify.com/proof.
I think they're extremely unfortunate. And so, first of all, I've pointed out for years, Simon, that short-term improvement of, let's say immune condition or cardiometabolic condition on almost any diet does not impress me, because you could reverse type 2 diabetes by getting cholera. Doesn't make cholera a desirable thing. You could reverse type 2 diabetes by getting cancer and chemotherapy. And you could reverse type 2 diabetes by giving up food altogether and going on a cocaine binge. I kid you not. I mean, all these conditions would be associated with massive reduction in serum cholesterol and a massive reduction in blood sugar. And they would all be absolutely terrible for you. So is what we care about, short-term metabolic perturbation, or is it about lifelong health and vitality? If it's about lifelong health and vitality, so yeah, I have type 2 diabetes. I'd like to reverse it. And then I'd like to live well and prosper with vitality too. Well, then you need to do it by a means that's not just good for you in the short term, but sustainably so. And that would not be cholera, and that would not be a cocaine binge, and that would not be chemotherapy. That would be, some means that promotes health from the origin. So these diets that are very restrictive, so a keto diet is very restrictive. And in comparison to the typical American diet, it's going to reduce your intake of calories. It's going to cause significant weight loss. It's going to lower your blood cholesterol for the most part, although not quite as reliably as almost every other alternative. It's going to lower blood sugar and so forth. But we have no evidence that that diet is sustainable over a lifetime. And so then, most people who use keto as a tactic are left to ask, now what? And most people who go on and off a keto diet lose weight and gain it back, reverse their type 2 diabetes, and then reacquire it. As opposed to a high-quality plant-predominant diet, which you can certainly stay on forever, where we also have evidence that you can reverse type 2 diabetes, but you can sustain that dietary approach. So in that sense, it's unfortunate in that there's sort of this distraction about short-term outcomes that do not factor in the context of longer term outcomes, because I want what's good for me now, and I also want it to be an investment in the future. And by the way, that kind of argues for thinking about health a little bit more like wealth, where, we certainly care whether or not we can buy what we want today, but we also think about saving money for the longer term. And we should think about health in exactly that same way. I want it today. I want to feel it today. I want to benefit from it today, but not at the expense of tomorrow. I don't want to spend everything I make today and then tomorrow I can't pay the bills. Well, health is like that too. I want to invest in my health for the long term. And then, of course, the other thing that's unfortunate is I truly do think, even, I'm a physician and spent 30 years taking care of patients and basically advancing the human condition was my life's work. I still think planetary health is the signature issue of our time, because we have some hope of being healthy, vital people on a healthy, vital planet, or we have no hope of being healthy, vital people at all. And so we have to attend to the health of the planet. So these arguments for keto and carnivore and so forth, they leave that out of the discussion altogether. We do not have that luxury. We simply do not have that luxury. So I think they're very unfortunate. Now, what if, big what if eating lots of meat, what if being carnivorous were our only choice? What if we were like lions? What if we were obligate carnivores? Well, then they'd be right. We'd have to eat meat. And then the questions would all be about, how can we do this without ravaging the planet? Do we do it by controlling the numbers of us? Do we do it by developing other means of producing the meat? It would be a completely different debate, right? It just turns out that we are constitutional omnivores who are clearly adapted to plant-predominant diets, and we do better when our diets are mostly plants, and we do absolutely fine when our diets are exclusively plants, and we simply don't do fine. Our microbiome doesn't do fine when for any extended period of time our diets are all meat. We just don't. One final comment, Simon, and that is these debates about meat and how much meat we should eat. They often invoke our adaptations from the Paleolithic and the fact that we are omnivores, and certainly our ancient ancestors did consume meat. They often fail to provide any clarity on the difference between the kind of meat they tended to eat and the kind of meat we eat today. And that information is readily available in the peer-reviewed literature. So if you're going to fly the paleo flag, be honest about the fact that there was no Paleolithic pepperoni and there were no Paleolithic hot dogs, right? And so the paleoanthropologists who've done this work and made the comparison say, well, you want to think about the kind of meat humans are adapted to eat, probably about the closest approximation in the modern world would be something like antelope. So let's look at the composition of the flesh of antelope. Well, the average beef cattle have about 35% of total calories in their flesh coming from fat, and most of that fat is saturated, and none of it's omega-3. The average flesh of antelope, 7% of the calories come from fat, so 1/5 the fat content. Almost none of it's saturated, and quite a lot of it is omega-3. So, okay, it's meat and it's meat, but it's night and it's day. Totally different. So, if you're going out with a bow and arrow to get that meat you're eating on the paleo diet, you probably do okay. If you're doing it some other way, hot dogs and hamburgers and pepperoni and so forth, yeah, those were not part of the Paleolithic diet.
Yeah, there's a couple of papers I'll put in the show notes. I think it's Lauren Cordain and Stanley Eaton who describe, and they're fathers, I guess, of the paleo movement, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
Right.
so I'll put that into the show notes for anyone that's interested in the facts there. But that gets me thinking about this whole idea of how do you, and I know you speak to this, I've heard you speak about this before, how do you get people to care more about the facts of nutrition and how it affects human health and planetary health, and be influenced by those facts more than being seduced by stories and anecdotes on social media?
I wish I knew, Simon. I wish I knew. I can tell you what I've tried to do, but I don't know the answer. I don't think anybody knows the answer. And, misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, they do travel more effectively than real facts for a whole host of reasons. One, you can make up whatever will travel most effectively. You can make up whatever titillation you want. Since you're not bounded by fact, you can simply prioritize what you think is going to captivate and titillate. The other thing that always comes to me in this context is a quote from Bertrand Russell, who said, "The whole thing wrong with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so sure, and wiser people so full of doubt." So you think of legitimate scientists, we almost never say absolutely, always, totally, complete. We're always hemming and hawing, and in general, and there are provisos, and there are exceptions, and there are edge cases, and that's how science works. But fools, fanatics, and I would append to Russell's list hucksters, so charlatans who've got something to sell, who know that it's not true, but are going to profit off of your gullibility. They're completely, adamantly sure. They promise you the moon and stars. I mean, every fad diet author that's ever been does this. So there's a magical formula no one else will tell you but me. And I guarantee, I mean, the weight will fall off. You'll have luxurious hair and radiant skin, and it will be effortless and easy and magical. And you'll only get it here because no one else is willing to tell you. There's been a massive conspiracy shielding you from this. I mean, that formula works every time. I don't know why we're such gullible nincompoops when it comes to diet nutrition, but we certainly are. And we've made almost every mistake it's imaginable to make, and we keep making them again and again and again. And with the advent of social media and now artificial intelligence and deep fakes and so forth, it's all getting worse. The one thing I've tried to do to answer this question, so how do you get people to, if not care more about the truth, at least know what the truth is to take a page from the playbook of Dr. Seuss and the Who's that Horton heard when they were in a critical fix, about to be boiled in bezelnut oil. The Who's saved themselves by pulling together and pooling their voices. And they all cried out together, "We are here," and they were heard and they were saved. So in this case, the message isn't "we are here," but the message is "we agree." That there's actually a massive amount of consensus among diverse global experts, and diverse global experts with different personal behaviors and preferences and practices and ideologies. So, it's all well and good if you can get a group of ardent vegans to say a plant-based diet is the way to go. But, you shrug your shoulders and say, they're all ardent vegans. Of course they're going to say that. But what if you can get, proponents of low carb diets to agree with that? Yeah, low carb's good, but you should do it from mostly plants because of planetary health and human health and the microbiome and all that. And what if you can get paleo advocates to say the same thing? We don't live in the Paleolithic anymore. Dorothy, we're not in the Paleolithic anymore, and you don't have enough acreage left on the planet with 8 billion hungry Homo sapiens for us to be hunter-gatherers. It's just, you'd need 15 times the surface area of the Earth. It's just not going to work. We need to get our protein mostly from plants now. And what if you can get the Mediterranean diet proponents to agree? Well, I did exactly that. I created a nonprofit many years ago called the True Health Initiative. And that is its beating heart. It's a global panel of experts from 50 countries, roughly 500 of us, diverse expertise, diverse preferences, diverse personal behaviors, but all coming together to say, yeah, incontrovertibly, these are the fundamentals of a healthy diet, a healthy lifestyle. We all agree. So that's what I've tried to do. But I think, and you know this, asking the question, what do we do to overcome all the noisy nonsense? We don't know, because the noisy nonsense just keeps getting louder and louder. And our ability to generate signal audible above the noise and the din has been beleaguered ever more over recent years. My hope, I've done one thing to try and overcome it, but I think for the most part we're losing the war. And by the way, we're losing the war with regard to nutrition and health, but we're also losing the war with regard to politics and democracy, and misinformation prevails everywhere to our detriment. So these are very perilous times. The one hope I have, Simon, is that when you think about individual humans, no matter how brilliant someone is destined to become, they pass through stages of psychological development. All children are gullible and impressionable. It's actually adaptive. We're social animals. One of the best ways to do well in a tribe is to fit in with the tribe. So whatever way people tell you you ought to behave, you believe it and you behave that way. It's one of the reasons why religion's so popular. You're raised in a religion, you're told these things are true, and you don't really challenge it. But as we grow and mature, we become more prone to question things. And ultimately, we become pretty skeptical as adolescents first. And then as adults, we have more mature filters to help us differentiate sense from nonsense, information from misinformation. I have the hope, although I have no particular evidence that we can count on this, that the hive mind may be prone to the same. So if we think of the internet as a hive mind, the flow of information initially is very naive. Just, it's on the internet, it must be true. Abraham Lincoln tweeted this, it must be true, right? And then, little by little it matures, and our ability to recognize misinformation, disinformation improves, and the hive mind becomes somewhat auto-correcting. It builds in those filters. I have that hope. I'm not sure it's true. And again, the burgeoning use of AI, if anything, risks taking us in the other direction. I keep reading more and more, I'm sure you do too, about how incredibly sophisticated deep fake production of audio, video can be. It's ever less prone to the customary filters. So I wish I knew the answer to your question.
Have you come across Steven Novella's work and his book, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe?
Yes, I've not read the book. I actually know of Steven Novella. Is a neurologist, I believe, at Yale, because I think we kind of were at loggerheads for many years. So before I became as identified with lifestyle medicine as I now am, I was long identified with integrative medicine, of which I'm quite proud, because as a clinician, quite simply, I was taking care of patients and they didn't all get better, or they didn't all get fully better. They had chronic conditions, they had chronic pain, they had chronic fatigue, they had all sorts of things I was really trying to help them with. And everything I had been taught in medical school and everything available in the textbooks, failed to do the job. They weren't as well as they wanted to be. And I reached the conclusion that the results of randomized controlled trials ran out long before the needs of my patients were fully met. And I wanted to help them. And so when I did everything I was trained to do and my patients weren't still fully better, I looked around for what else is there to try. And that brought me into the realm of a more holistic approach to medicine and integrative medicine. And I did confer with naturopathic physicians, and I was able to help some of my patients. So I actually developed a model of care, evidence-based integrative medicine, where I work collaboratively with naturopaths. We saw patients together. We specialized in the treatment of hard-to-treat patients, so patients who had stuff that had been everywhere, seen everybody, tried everything, still weren't better. And we put our heads together, and we were very careful about evidence, but we also recognized that sometimes we had to go beyond the highest standards of evidence, because everything that had been subject to a meta-analysis had been tried and failed already. So what's the next reasonable thing to try? Steven Novella considered that quackery, and was quite blunt about saying so. So that's how we knew one another.
Okay. Well, I didn't know about that backstory, but the point that I wanted to make, that was a rather short point, was that his view is that one of the most important things that we need to do to tackle misinformation and disinformation in the scientific kind of realm is to improve scientific literacy. And where I think this overlaps with one of your earlier points, you were talking about how scientists generally do not speak in absolutes. And there is this sort of degree of humility that a good objective scientist approaches, their scientific investigations with, and how they speak about the research. But at least on social media, my observation is that humility, not speaking in absolutes, speaking in uncertainty, is conflated with a lack of credibility, a lack of understanding by the layperson who is consuming this information and is not scientifically trained. And so I wonder if there needs to be a greater appreciation across society as to what good science communication actually looks like.
Yeah. So I would agree there. I think the problem is that scientists can disagree about what's credible. So I don't know Stephen personally. We've just had encounters over the years. But I've done my homework. I've conducted and published dozens of randomized controlled trials. I've conducted and published meta-analyses. I've conducted and published systematic reviews. I've written textbooks on epidemiologic and research methods. So, I'm qualified to talk about this stuff. And quite simply, the randomized controlled trial is not the only source of evidence. And in many instances, what humans know that matters most to getting through a typical day is based on pure observation. And quite frankly, correlation is causation at a certain remove. I mean, when every time A happens, B happens, it's because A is causing B. It just is, and we all know this. We all know that if you put your hand in a fire, it's going to get burned. And there are no randomized control trials on the topic. We all know that it's prudent to look both ways before crossing a busy street, and most parents would agree it's ill-advised for children to run with scissors. No meta-analyses on any of these topics, right? It's just pure observation and sense. So I completely agree. I think scientific literacy in the general public would be really helpful, but we have to be careful not to conflate an understanding of science with a particular stipulated view of science and where truth comes from. And we have to be, I think the humility has to extend to how sense plays a role in the interpretation of science. I would go further and say that you could make the case that good scientific methods share the force of a freight train in driving toward hard-to-reach truths. But unless sense lays the tracks, you are likely to wind up with a train wreck. The question that an RCT answers derives from sense. Sensible interpretation of what we already know. What is it we need to know? What's a valid and important question that, if we answer it, will help us advance the human condition? We don't always get that. Very often the question is quite contrived, and it's contrived to support a particular agenda. So there are many layers to the onion of scientific literacy. In general, though, my simple position would be I agree with Dr. Novella. I think better scientific literacy, so people know what is credible, what's not, would at least be a step in the right direction. I don't think it fully solves the problem, but it can only help.
And the last thing I'll say on this is that a poet friend of mine, in Q, has this beautiful poem about the current state of the world and how we can get to where we want to get to. And one of the things he says is we need to repopularize being able to say, I don't know.
I'm proud to say I have long said that. In fact, on record, I've written it many times. You ever see a doctor who can't say that? Run like hell out of the office and find another doctor. There's nothing more dangerous. Yeah, we've all got to know what we don't know. We've got to all be okay admitting it. And you could say, look, If I'm your doctor and you're asking me a question I can't answer, I will look into it and I will get back to you when I have an answer, but I don't know today. Yeah, absolutely crucial.
And that's not a red flag. That's not a reason to think your doctor is not educated. It's actually a green flag that your doctor understands their limits and is prepared to not give you a quick answer, but go away and give you a well-researched answer.
Couldn't agree more.
I've had a bunch of friends ask me recently, Simon, do you actually rate 8 Sleep? So here's the truth. I would not promote 8 Sleep if it hadn't genuinely helped me. It has literally transformed my sleep. Since adding the Pod 4 Ultra and then more recently the Pod 5 Ultra to my bed, I've been waking up feeling fresh, clear-headed, less inflamed in the face and fingers, and ready to take on the day with enthusiasm, rigor, kindness, and patience, all good things. That's what a proper night of recovery does. It literally makes me a better human. The Pod 5 isn't a mattress. It's a high-tech cover that fits over your existing bed. It personalizes the temperature on each side, tracks your sleep stages, and even detects snoring, gently adjusting your position to help stop it. And now with the new Pod Blanket, that same intelligent temperature control extends across your entire body. It's like sleeping in a cocoon that actively helps you recover. This is hands down one of the best investments I've ever made for my health. Head to 8sleep.com/theproof and use the code THEPROOF to get $350 off your Pod 5 Ultra. And you've got 30 days to try it. And if you don't like it, which I can't see happening, send it back for a full refund. Shipping to many countries worldwide. See details at 8sleep.com/theproof. Coming back to ultra processed foods, we mentioned that we were going to double click on these. So we spoke about a perfect plate earlier. Of course, most people don't eat a perfect plate at every meal or every day. And in reality, I think as of today, 50 or 60% of the average American's calories are coming from this group of foods that we describe as ultra processed. And over recent years, researchers like Kevin Hall and others have performed these controlled feeding trials that have shown that ultra-processed diets lead to overeating and weight gain compared to minimally processed diets, even when meals are designed to be similar in kind of macronutrient content and sugar and sodium and fiber, all these things. And then just recently, the American Heart Association issued a scientific advisory sort of highlighting the cardiometabolic risks of ultra-processed foods and calling for policy changes, policy action. And I know that you wrote a blog on this. You sent it to me yesterday. From your perspective, what are the most important takeaways about this group of foods, ultra-processed foods, for people to understand?
So, Simon, ultra-processed foods to begin with are what we used to call junk food. And we've switched the nomenclature, largely courtesy of the work of Professor Carlos Monteiro and colleagues at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, who gave us the NOVA classification. So we now have an operational definition of what used to be junk food. So it used to be junk food was, vaguely defined, but you kind of knew it when you saw it. And mostly you looked away because you wanted to eat it and didn't want to have to confront the fact that it was junk where food ought to be. We now have ultra-processed food. And there are 4 stages of processing in the NOVA classification, beginning with wholly unprocessed foods and ending with foods that use ingredients that a home cook would not have in the kitchen. And the main thing we need to be aware of is that there is a massive overlap between long ingredient lists and ultra processing and the commercial manufacture of foods and excesses of added salt, added sugar, added flavorants that stimulate the appetite center, and all the wrong kinds of fat. So, leaving aside the issue of how much a food is processed, and leaving aside for the moment the issue of how much direct damage is being done by texturizers and emulsifiers and preservatives, food chemicals that aren't a major part of the recipe but that are serving some functional role, there is a tremendous amount of overlap between the fundamental liabilities of the modern diet: too much added sugar, too much salt, too much saturated fat, too much of the wrong kinds of unsaturated fat or just imbalances there, and ultra-processed food. those things go together. These are things that come in bags, boxes, bottles, jars, and cans with very long ingredient lists. And then there's another critical consideration. So first, what we ought to be looking out for is highly processed food that's giving us way too much of what we get too much of. And by the way too little of what we get too little of, like, for example, fiber. To me, the real story about ultra-processed food is the intention. And, food processing originally had as its intention food safety, extending shelf life, keeping things from spoiling, making it possible to eat food in winter that we grew in the summer and that kind of thing. But it just, like everything else, it evolved and then ultimately devolved so that it took on a whole host of other objectives. They've been described a number of times in high-profile places like the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times. The best place you can look is the work of Michael Moss, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist, author of 2 books, Salt, Sugar, Fat, and Hooked, all about the machinations of the food industry. There was an excerpt from the first of those 2 books, Salt, Sugar, Fat, that was used as a New York Times Magazine cover story in, I think it was 2013. It goes back a ways now. The title was The Extraordinary Science of Addictive Junk Food. Let that sink in for a second. The extraordinary science of addictive junk food. And in that story, and you can read this for yourself, just Google Moss addictive and you'll pull this right up. Michael tells the story of how every major multinational food company hires a team of scientists with the best credentials that money can buy, gives them the best tech that money can buy, like functional MRI machines, and marching orders to devise and design food people can't stop eating until their arms get tired from lifting it to their mouths. We all, I suppose, remember the Lay's potato chip ads from back in the day, bet you can't eat just one. Well, that was a threat, and one they were prepared to laugh about all the way to the bank. And it wasn't just Lay's potato chips, it was everything in the ultra-processed food supply. So for me, the critical thing we should be looking at with ultra-processed food is, what is it for from the production side of the equation? And what it's for is to propagate overeating. It's food you cannot stop eating. So you eat more of it, so you finish it faster, so you replace it sooner, so you spend more money, which is bad for you because you're basically spending your money to get fat and sick, but it's good for the person selling the stuff. That's the story. So for the most part, it's easy to identify this junk food. It's, it doesn't look like anything direct from nature. It comes in colors that are not part of the natural world. It's got these ingredient lists that run off the page. And it's got these highly potent flavors because it's got added salt and added sugar, and it's got artificial flavorants and so forth. And there's an awful lot in the food supply that's that. It's frankenfood. It's junk where food ought to be. Pretty easily identifiable if you're being, brutally honest with yourself. And the problem there is both that it is a delivery vehicle for all sorts of stuff that's harmful to you, the excess salt, the excess sugar, the wrong kinds of fat. But it's specifically designed to make you overeat. It's designed to put the human appetite center into overdrive. And it's designed to do that because the foods are engineered to achieve something called a bliss point, which essentially maximizes the quantity of eating we do before we feel full. I'd like to digress for just a second and point something out to people. If you've ever overeaten at a big family celebration, a major holiday, for example, Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, whatever it may be, you know the scenario where you eat and eat and eat, and it's all wonderful until you really feel like you couldn't eat another bite. And you lay down your fork and you moan and you groan and say, oh God, I overate, I couldn't eat another bite. And then either you or somebody near you at the table says, that's true, what's for dessert? And not too long after, you are eating dessert. You couldn't eat another bite, but what's for dessert? We've all experienced that. And there are usually jokes to go along with that about an extra stomach or a hollow leg. We do anatomy in medical school, and we didn't find those. The answer is something called sensory-specific satiety. So the appetite center in the ventromedial hypothalamus of the human brain is wired in a sensory specific manner, meaning that if you eat salty food, at some point you don't want any more salty food, but you may still want sweet or sour or savory. If you eat enough savory food, you still only want sweet. If you eat enough sweet food, you may want salty. And if you can engineer all of those flavors into all foods all the time, they put the appetite center into overdrive. You've created variety within an individual food. Ultra processed food is a buffet in a box, essentially. And it's one of the mechanisms by which it stimulates overconsumption. So what you look out for is anything that doesn't look like real food, anything where the ingredients are unrecognizable, anything where you'd be really hard pressed to say what part of the natural world what tree did this grow on, what soil did this come from, what kind of ambulation did this animal have. I mean, you can't tell where it came from. It's probably ultra processed. But the real liability is the fact that the majority of ultra processed foods are designed to foster overconsumption and all the ills that result from that. And that's because that's highly profitable, and it makes perfect sense.
So these multinational food companies are really exploiting our biology that we've been handed through evolution that once would have served humans very well in periods of famine.
Exactly right. I mean, everything about our adaptations works well in a natural world. It just can be turned against us in a world that is as contrived as ours.
If you're in the grocery store and you're trying to navigate this space, how do you distinguish between ultra processed foods that may actually be health promoting versus those that are not health promoting? And I asked this question because I saw that the AHA scientific advisory paper sort of specifically called out certain foods like whole grain bread or low sugar yogurt or even nut butters that could be considered processed or ultra processed. What would the difference be between a food that's ultra processed and might be one that you want to steer clear of versus one that could be health promoting?
I have a different example in mind than theirs. So in general, I line up very well with the AHA paper. They basically talk about the fact that for the most part, ultra processed food and bad food overlap. And in the blog post I shared with you, Simon, and feel free to post that for the audience, I drew a Venn diagram, which basically was ultra processed food and bad food or junk food. And they massively overlap, but they don't overlap perfectly, meaning there can be some ultra processed food that isn't bad and some bad food that isn't ultra processed. And I think that's the reality. And the AHA paper does a very nice job of parsing that nuance. And then they use these various examples. They point out, as I just did, that overwhelmingly food that's ultra processed is also a delivery vehicle for all sorts of stuff that's bad for you. Excess salt, excess sugar, wrong kinds of fat, and so forth. So for the most part, it's an easy call. This food would have been bad for you even if it wasn't ultra processed, and it's ultra processed. So, it's easy. I would use a different example, though, to point out that it all comes down to intention. So, again, with a lot of ultra processed food, now the intention is, as Michael Moss describes, it's designed to be as addictive as possible. It's designed for the bliss point. It's designed to make you overeat. And your obesity and type 2 diabetes be damned, because I don't care. I'm going to profit off of your gullibility. You're going to buy it. You're going to eat it. I'm going to get rich. So too bad for you. I mean, that's the food industry perspective as far as I can tell. But sometimes food is put together to service a completely different objective. And we have to think about what the intention was and what space in the overall food supply and in our diets that food occupies. And the best example from my point of view is plant-based meats. So I'm mostly vegan. I unashamedly acknowledge that I eat mostly plants. And whenever possible, when I've got control over my diet, I'm not traveling and so forth, I eat only plants, and happily so. So I'm not interested in, plant-based meats that bleed. I gave up beef as a teenager. I haven't eaten mammals since then. I haven't eaten poultry in a very long time. And I don't want my burger to bleed. My wife makes these fantastic vegan burgers. They're absolutely delicious. They don't bleed. I'm perfectly happy with them. I don't need alternatives to beans and lentils because I actually love those. That's me. Okay. I'm not saying that needs to be you. I'm just saying that's me. So Impossible and Beyond, those things they were never for me. I never wanted them. I never needed them. Who are they for? Well, they're for my patients who've eaten meat their whole lives, who love the taste of it, who are familiar with the taste of it, who don't really know how to live any other way, but who say, yes, doc, I'd like to be healthier. And yes, doc, I don't want to be responsible for cruelty. And yes, doc, I don't want to be the reason the Amazon rainforest gets burnt down. But this is how I like to eat. Can I have my beef and not eat it too? And the answer is yes, with Beyond and Impossible and ultimately other alternative cell cultured meat and so forth. So the sadly, from my point, so I very early on started weighing in about these products and said, these are great. These are not directed to vegans and vegetarians. They're directed to carnivores who have a carnivorous palate, who are never going to give up beef altogether unless they can eat an alternative that satisfies. But if they can, first of all, you've immediately cut out the cruelty and you've immediately reduced the environmental impact. And maybe it's a gateway food too. Maybe the fact that it's made out of plants will have these people interested in trying more plants and will shift diet in a favorable direction. It's all good. My community of nutrition experts immediately started weighing in about how processed these products were. And then, we got preoccupied with the work of Carlos and colleagues and the NOVA classification, and these foods qualified as ultra processed. And I think we threw out the baby with the bathwater, and the whole plant-based meat industry tanked. I mean, after very high valuations for Beyond and Impossible, their sales plummeted. And I think that all had to do with being tarnished with the label of ultra processed. And I think that was a terrible mistake. These were not foods that were designed to be addictive. These were not foods that were processed more than they needed to be to make you overeat. This was an effort to say, can we satisfy the palates of carnivores in a way that's massively less harmful to our fellow creatures and the planet? And then that leaves unanswered a third question. What about the direct human health effects? Are they better for you than the hamburger you'd be eating instead? So early on, I wrote a piece, I think, on Medium, where somewhat ironically, it turned out that the final word on the topic of plant-based meats was courtesy of a guy named Meatloaf. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. I said, look, if we take those 3 windows I talked about earlier, right, we should look at food through, what are the direct human health effects? How are we treating our fellow creatures? And what are the planetary health effects? Well, we don't yet know the direct human health effects of these plant-based meats, but we know there's no cruelty to animals involved, and it's much better for the planet. And we do know those 2 things, by the way, and we know them even more now than when I wrote this piece. And I said, that's good enough for me. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Thank you, Meatloaf, for weighing in on plant-based meat. In the years since I wrote that, there has been research looking at direct human health effects. In particular, a study called Swap Meat by Christopher Gardner at Stanford, which looked at plant-based meat directly versus comparable beef. So this hamburger versus an alternative hamburger, and a whole host of biomarkers. And there was clearly a net human health benefit of the plant-based meat. So yes, ultra processed. But, frankly, the hamburgers that people are eating, they're ultra processed too, in the sense that it's beef on an usually ultra processed bun and sometimes with ultra processed ketchup. And so, let's make a valid comparison here. The switch to a plant-derived source still winds up being a net benefit. So now it's not just that 2 out of 3 ain't bad, but 3 out of 3 is really good. So I think there are exceptions to ultra processing being in the service of bad intentions. I think there are times it can be directly in the service of really good intentions. And we have to very carefully differentiate baby from bathwater. So the AHA and I are completely aligned on that point of view. I just might choose different examples because I think, for example, the whole grain bread, I think you can find whole grain bread that isn't ultra processed. I suppose what they're talking about there is just the inclusion of something like, so it's whole grain bread and it's got an emulsifier or, some ingredient you wouldn't have in your home kitchen. So it qualifies as ultra processed. And last thing I'll say is I've had some interesting conversations directly with Professor Montero, who's a friend, about this issue. And, you think maybe there's some way to refine the definition of ultra processing, so it has something to do with why that ingredient is there, what role it's playing. The one other thing that's important, and I agree with the AHA on this topic as well, we have a general understanding that ultra processed food and bad food overlap. We don't know yet an awful lot about all the different ingredients that could result in qualifying as ultra processed, like, for example, any given emulsifier or texturizer, and the specific health effects of that. I think we kind of want to know both. We want to know that in general, ultra processing is bad, and in general, there are exceptions to ultra processing being bad. But we'd also like to know, and by the way, here's the very long list of ingredients that would result in the designation of ultra processed, and here's what they do to human metabolism and physiology and biomarkers and health. We don't have all those answers yet. I agree with the AHA. It would be good to get more answers.
Yeah, which gets me thinking about the solution here. Is there a world where 50% of calories can continue to come from ultra processed foods? Because you mentioned earlier that ultra processed foods have served a role in terms of shelf stability and helping solve food security problems across the world over the years. Is there a world where ultra processed foods could be health promoting if reformulated to not be hyper palatable, to not have the same amount of sodium and saturated fat and refined sugars? Or is it clear from the evidence that in order to improve public health, we have to shift to minimally processed diets?
I think we've only lived in a world where ultra-processed foods are about driving overconsumption and are associated with excesses of sugar, salt, and the wrong kinds of fat. So I don't think we know the answer for sure. If we think of fortification as ultra-processing, we have clear evidence of benefit. Fortifying the food supply with folate has produced a massive reduction in neural tube defects, a very important kind of birth defect. We have many other examples. We've prevented goiter by fortifying table salt with iodine, and on it goes. So, there are varieties of processing the food supply that are all about specific public health benefit. Then there are varieties of processing the food supply that are all about public health detriment for the sake of corporate profit. It's reasonable to presume that there's a middle space where we have lots of latitude and we could direct processing toward the virtuous goals of producing food for people to consume and away from predatory profiteering. So I think fundamentally the answer to your question is a very probable yes, that it's the reasons for the ultra processing. What is it directed at achieving that ultimately matter? And could we carve out those elements of processing that are about extending shelf life? I mean, for example, I don't know how people react when they hear this, but I'm not opposed to GMOs. I see genetic modification as a method. And what I care about is a method in the service of what? I mean, I'm inclined to argue that the fact that I have 3 dogs I love very much is also a product of genetic modification. Their ancestors were wolves, and we selectively bred them to get the kinds of dogs we want to have living in our homes. It's not quite the same, but it's not all that different either. And many of the flowers in my garden were selectively bred and modified, and I enjoy them, and they thrive partly because of how they've been cultivated. So, with genetic modification of foods, the only difference is that we're sometimes borrowing the genes from one species to put in another. And we have to be very careful about the law of unintended consequences, right? So can we do harmful things with GMOs? Absolutely, yes. But on the other hand, if they can significantly extend the shelf life of fruits and vegetables so more people can consume them, and the price points come down because they are more shelf stable, and it doesn't compromise the nutrition, and it's not triggering food allergies and so forth, honestly, that's a good thing. And so, I suppose in some sense, that's the ultimate form of food processing. It doesn't show up in the NOVA classification because NOVA doesn't get into genes. But you could argue that the most extreme form of processing of food is the genetic engineering of it. But there's some remarkable advances associated with genetically modified foods that increase yields and that are clearly advancing public health around the globe. So yes, I think I could imagine a world, Simon, where ultra processing is, or at least processing, ultra it almost implies you've gone further than you needed to go, right? So whatever degree of processing is required to do the essential thing, whether it's extending shelf life or protecting select crops against the potential harms of frost. You could potentially make oranges more cold tolerant, and you could make things more drought tolerant, and this could be at the level of the plants that produce the food or at the level of the food or both. Yeah, I think there's real opportunity there. We have to be, and we mentioned this earlier, right? Science should be humble. We should always be quaking a little bit about the law of unintended consequences. We should if anytime we're doing something innovative, we should trust that it has potential to be good, but also verify very, very carefully that it's actually doing good. But yeah, I'm not ideologically opposed to processing. I am ideologically opposed to processing in the service of corporate profits at the expense of public health, and that's mostly what we have.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. I think there is a knee-jerk reaction to again just toss out all ultra processed foods because they are processed. So I think the important kind of take home point here is that it might not necessarily be the processing. Potentially processing could be contributing to this for certain ingredients in terms of how they're metabolized and utilized by the body and their effect on satiety. But the evidence is suggesting that things like hyperpalatability and the caloric density, eating rate, as well as the exposure to some of these nutrients where we're already over-consuming, like sodium and saturated fat and added sugars, probably explains why these foods are associated with increased morbidity and mortality more than the fact they're processed.
Agreed. The most recent study, Kevin Hall was a participant, others in a UK population, was a metabolic ward study, and theoretically the two diets were matched for macronutrient distribution and more or less matched for diet quality, and there was still an interference with weight loss with ultra processed foods. So there was less weight loss when the food was ultra processed. That may have to do with the degradation of fiber and some of the mechanical elements of processing, or perhaps a slightly greater energy density. But we need to dig into that, because if there is an effect of certain components of processing per se, and they affect how many calories it takes to feel full, and they affect energy balance, we want to deepen our understanding of that so we can navigate around those issues. But for the most part, yeah, I think what people need to understand is, by and large, ultra processed food and food that would be bad for you even if it weren't ultra processed overlap tremendously. And the intentions behind the major suite of ultra processed foods in the modern food supply was to propagate overconsumption from the start. If we eliminate all that badness, then we have all sorts of opportunity to use processing to our advantage and to create a safer, more stable, more reliable food supply. And frankly, I don't think we're going to have a choice because of what we're doing to the climate. We're putting so many of our foods in peril because the circumstances that favor their cultivation are changing. We're going to have to adapt to that one way or another.
So with all of that in mind, how do you feel about the current government's focus on, or at least to me, it seems like the focus has been more on single ingredients, at least what's reported in the media, things like Red 40 and seed oils. Is that where you would, if you were part of the government that was given the task of trying to improve the average diet in America, increase adherence to this healthy eating index, change the food environment, is that where you would be focusing your time and energy, or is that a distraction from what you think matters most?
The latter. Yeah, I think it's a distraction. I think, any single die is just part of a larger problem of too much frankenfood, too much chemistry where real food ought to be. Seed oils are a complete boondoggle. Canola oil is one of the healthiest choices you can make. It depends, obviously, on how the oil is produced. So there's a difference between mechanically pressed and chemically extracted, organic versus not, and there are different versions of these things. But the evidence is overwhelming of the advantages there. And other seed oils are probably better than the oils they're replacing. But at a certain level of nuance, I would agree that we get too much omega-6 fat, not enough omega-3 fat. Oils in processed foods are part of that problem. So Yeah, there's an issue there, but it's being overblown. And frankly, replacing seed oil with beef tallow is a tremendous mistake. It's an environmental mistake. It's a human health mistake. It's taking the situation into far worse territory. So yeah, it's definitely not where my focus would be. My focus would be exactly where my focus is. If we could do just one thing to improve diet quality in America, I would say let's make everybody vividly aware of what their diet quality is and what it could be. And let's put that information in front of every healthcare professional. How would that reverberate? So I've written a thought experiment on this. There was a time before the invention of the blood pressure cuff when the House of Medicine already knew how important blood pressure was. We knew that it was a major contributor to heart attack and stroke, but we had no convenient way of measuring it. We could measure it with intra-arterial catheters, which are quite painful. So, they were only used in extreme circumstances. And by the way, we still use them in extreme circumstances. Now I've put them in over the course of my career. But we had no convenient way of measuring blood pressure, so we didn't. We just knew that in general it's a problem, and if your blood pressure is high, you're at increased risk of heart attack or stroke. So how did we know that your blood pressure was high? We waited until you had a heart attack or stroke because we couldn't measure it beforehand. So when you had your first stroke, we said, I bet your blood pressure is not so good. And maybe then we put in an intra-arterial catheter when you were in the hospital. The advent of sphygmomanometry, the non-invasive measurement of blood pressure with a blood pressure cuff, was a massive transformation in everything about medicine. Prevailing clinical practice, medical education, qualifications, credential, everything. Because we suddenly had this critically important upstream information and we had to be able to deal with it. So if physicians had not formerly been trained in how to respond to blood pressure numbers, they had to learn. And if medical education didn't address the critical importance of measuring systolic and diastolic blood pressure, they had to change medical education. And if population-level health programs were not being credentialed based on how routinely they measured and managed blood pressure, that had to change, and everything did change. It was absolutely transformational, and none of us can imagine a world now where blood pressure isn't routinely measured. We're all used to having it done. It's just a fixture. Well, where we were before the invention of the blood pressure cuff is where we are with regard to diet. Diet quality measured objectively, to take us back to the very beginning of our conversation, is the single leading predictor variable for premature death from all causes in the United States today. And it's measured in just about nobody. So we know that diet quality is a problem in general at the population level, just like we knew about blood pressure before the blood pressure cuff, but we don't measure it in anybody. And the way we know that your diet's broken is you develop obesity or type 2 diabetes or hypertension or dyslipidemia or all of the above. Just exactly the way the world was with blood pressure before the blood pressure cuff was invented. So this phase of my career took me from academic medicine to being an accidental entrepreneur because I invented a new way to assess diet. We can do it in 60 seconds. It's effortless. It's painless. It's even fun. It's over any digital interface. We don't need body specimens of any kind. You just play this game and we've got your diet in about 60 seconds. And we can generate a measure, the objective measure of your diet quality. So it's as easy to do as a blood pressure. So my argument is diet quality should be a vital sign. And what I would argue this administration can and should do is if you're really serious about making Americans healthier, again, or for the first time, and you want a preferential focus on diet, let's make diet quality objectively measured, not ideological, but just, whatever your kind of diet you have, we're going to measure using the best metric we've got. Let's make that universal as blood pressure. Let's get that in front of every person. So as a patient, we all know our diet quality the way we know our blood pressure and maybe our BMI and maybe our cholesterol. And in front of every healthcare professional, and then let's require that the healthcare professionals deal with this. If you can't deal with it yourself, make an appropriate referral. If you aren't educated in this area, get educated. We're going to start elevating the standard of clinical care so that every health professional has to be able to deal with this, because for health professionals not to be able to deal with the single leading predictor variable for all-cause mortality really seems like a pretty serious dereliction of duty, doesn't it? So it's time to adapt or die. So that's the change I would make. That change can be made. I think that would be transformational. And by the way, that would get at all these other subsidiary issues. So, the quality of fats in your diet figure in the score that you get for your overall diet quality. If you're eating more processed foods with artificial dyes and probably also bringing along for the ride excess sodium and sugar, that shows up in your diet quality. So if you fix the big picture, you fix the components of the big picture. If you fixate on some component, it's the famous case of, being diverted by the trees and not seeing the forest. So I would argue that the whole forest here is burning down, and we could focus attention on that by making diet quality a vital sign and an actionable cue to every patient and every healthcare professional.
Do you think that and that sounds like an incredible tool and very empowering for an individual. Do you think that would need to be paired with things that change the food environment, or do you think we have enough willpower to make healthy choices given the right information, despite an environment that is seducing us at literally every corner?
It's a great question, Simon. I'd say, in a sense, a little bit of both. Not so much because of willpower, but so what I'm talking about, for those who want to know more about it, the company I founded is called Diet ID, and you can learn more about this at dietid.com. So, in our diet map, we don't recommend to you a diet that you're not interested in. We can assess your baseline diet, but you're talking about dietary change. So how do we deal with that? Well, we have a multicultural diet map. We ask you two questions as we help you find a personalized goal diet. The first is, what does you want diet to do for you? Do you want to lower your blood pressure? Do you want to lose weight? Do you want to improve your immunity? Do you want to address the health of your microbiome? Do you want to retain your cognition? Do you want to optimize a pregnancy outcome? Do you want to manage symptoms of menopause? Click all that. Do you want to maximize athletic performance? And if so, is it stamina or strength or recovery? Click all that pertain. How can we deal with all these things? Well, because there's a preponderance of peer-reviewed evidence on all these topics that link different dietary patterns in foods and components of foods to these different outcomes. So we use the preponderance of peer-reviewed evidence as a filter. We built algorithms that say, whatever box you click, we will run through that filter the diets that line up against this objective. So you click however many you want, and we then show you, here are the 7 diets that best line up against this combination of objectives you have, right? We're not telling you how to eat. You're telling us what you want diet to do. Here are the diets that do that best. And we then show you all of those in an image you can look at and ask you, of these, which looks appealing? And you pick. And if you started out with an ethnic diet, so you're Cuban American or Mexican American or Vietnamese American, and you brought with you the traditions from your native land, we show you that version of it. Here's an optimized version of a Vietnamese American diet, so that if that matters to you, you don't have to opt out of your native cuisine. We've just helped you optimize it and choose the best from it so you can love food that loves you back. So you asked a question about willpower or food environment. I'd say there's much less willpower involved when you're being invited to love food that loves you back than when you're being told, hey, no matter what you like to eat, you have to eat this way, right? So we don't do that. We use this same objective measure of diet quality across this wide array of dietary choices in the service of helping people love food that loves them back. And yes, we should change the food environment because there are many obstacles. I mean, obviously, there are people who live in food swamps and food deserts and people who have food insecurity and people who can't afford this. We should combine with this awareness of how to improve diet in a lane that you actually want to be in. We should combine that with behavioral economics. So there should be financial incentives to choose more nutritious foods and move in the direction that would be good for your health. Because, the economics of business as usual are absolutely terrible. We make horrible food inexpensive, resulting in horrible health that's massively expensive. And we could incentivize the selection of highly nutritious food and curtail the expenses on the healthcare side. So all we have to do is align the perspectives so that, the money that's supporting good food choices is coming from the bucket that winds up paying for healthcare expenditure, right? So the government can do that. Government is subsidizing SNAP and other assistance programs in the food space, and obviously plays a major role in what food gets produced via the USDA and agricultural policy and the Farm Bill. And the government is also responsible for Medicare and Medicaid and, massive amount of healthcare expenditure. So spend a little more at the front end for, helping people get to better food, save a ton of money at the back end. And so I think we should do both. I think we can change the food environment. I think ultimately we shift food production. I think we can educate people to make better choices. But I don't think we should lean too hard on willpower. We don't really have to. I think we can lead people in a direction they actually want to go. And we coined the term behavioral navigation. Historically, when you talk about changing behavior, it's either behavior change or behavior modification, which is here we are in our lab coats. You're broken. We're going to fix you. And, that's just not terribly appealing. Navigation is GPS. It's not telling you where to go. You tell it where you want to go. It just helps you get there by giving you a turn list. We're doing that for food choice. And I think if you approach it that way, there's much less willpower involved.
Everything that you said there about making healthy, nutritious foods more available, the effect that that has on chronic disease and the costs of healthcare associated with chronic disease are things that on paper seem to be very common sense kind of oriented. And I think there'll be a lot of people listening who are in dismay or perhaps a little bit pessimistic about a future where a government actually does what is required to make those changes because of the corporate interests that you spoke to before. Are you optimistic that a government can actually make changes to the food environment such that the convenient, easy, simple choice is healthy, nutritious food as opposed to these ultra processed, quote unquote junk foods that you mentioned earlier, where there are these huge corporate multinational companies, doing everything they can, fighting tooth and nail to make sure that the status quo, remains as it is today?
Yeah, I don't know. I have not been hopeful. I've been doing what I do for the better part of 40 years and waiting to see progress we haven't made. This administration has been particularly adamant about their willingness to make change in that area. On the other hand, this is a radically anti-regulatory administration. So the idea that it's going to be the first administration ever to effectively regulate the food industry when it's generally anti-regulatory and far more regulation inclined administrations have failed to regulate food industry seems a bit far-fetched to me. So I'm waiting to see what happens. But I've always argued that as much as I'd like to see effective policy change, the single best way to modify the food supply is to modify the food demand. We know that works. We've seen it work. We've had natural experiments. We've had fad diets that have just caught fire, like the Atkins diet in the early 2000s. And tens of millions of people are suddenly all trying this diet. And the kind of food it requires is not readily available. And the food production side jumps through hoops to make that food available. So there were no low-carb foods in American supermarkets before the Atkins diet caught fire. And within 12 weeks of that hitting the New York Times bestseller list, there were some in every supermarket in America. And within just a little bit longer than that, there were lots. That was a direct response to consumer demand. Now, I'm not saying it was a good thing because it was mostly low-carb junk food that was being peddled. But I'm just saying we have a power we tend not to exercise or even recognize. The food demand overwhelms the food supply. The food supply is subordinate and responsive to the food demand. So if we could do enough to raise awareness about the difference between good food and junk food and have people express their desire for the former at every cash register, the food industry would reform itself without the need for government intercession. So I'd like to see a bit of both. I'd like the policymakers to do what they can do. I'd like to see us get better at empowering the individual consumer with actionable information, like knowing what their diet quality is, what their diet quality could be and the advantages of it, and what the difference is and how to get there from here. We can do that. We can share all that information by moving electrons around. So I'm hopeful, but I'm not holding my breath.
So that's dietid.com. That was
Correct.
the URL. Okay, we'll put that into the show notes for anyone who wants to check that out. Changing gears here before we kind of land the plane today. I've never asked you about supplements. Everything we've been talking about today has been about the food that we do or don't eat. And you and I are both on the IM8 Scientific Advisory Board. And of course, supplements are super popular today. So what's your overall view when it comes to supplements and their role in health optimization?
Supplement, don't substitute. So the very name kind of says what their role ought to be from my point of view. Simon, they're in addition to. What I think we fail to do routinely enough is even bother to ask the question, in addition to what? So what do I need to do as the right foundation if I'm going to then append this? And just to back up to Diet ID for a second, so the report that we can issue in 60 seconds includes not just the measure of your diet quality, but your intake per day and servings of all the different foods, and your intake per day in appropriate units, grams, milligrams, micrograms, about 200 different nutrients. So we can tell you in 60 seconds what nutrients you're deficient in. I think our efforts to supplement should be personalized with that kind of information. What do you need? Back to my point about diet quality, the critical thing it should be about is balance, providing a balanced array of foods and nutrients to service the needs of your native physiology and metabolism. Similarly here, supplements should be doing something for you. So what do you need more of and why do you need it? Now, sometimes it's not just about addressing a shortfall or a deficiency, it's about achieving a particular goal. So you may be taking omega-3 because you have an inflammatory condition and you want to reduce inflammation. You may be taking creatine because you're looking to build some more muscle and it favors that. You may take a probiotic to ameliorate some food sensitivities or improve your overall digestive health, and on it goes. Vitamin D for the health of your immune system and skeleton. And so, in some cases, you're taking extra and you have a particular goal in mind. And there are times when nutrient supplements are actually being used as nutraceuticals. In other words, we're taking a mega dose of something and expecting it to have a therapeutic or even pharmacotherapeutic like effect. I think all that's legitimate too, but you need to know why. You can't just take it. I heard it's good for me and I'm taking it. There ought to be a case of the form, the supplement, following some particular function, which in some cases can be as vague as an insurance policy. I think many people who take a multivitamin I'm not sure what I might not be getting enough of, and so just to be on the safe side. So, in that sense, it provides peace of mind, and there's some evidence that multivitamins confer some benefits. But by and large, I think the concept of supplementation needs to be put in the context where this is in addition to the benefits you get from getting lifestyle right. It can never be instead of. We have absolutely no evidence that you can replace the benefits of healthy diet, healthy physical activity, adequate sleep, managing your stress, healthy social connections, avoiding toxic substances like excess alcohol and tobacco, that any of that can be supplanted by some supplement you take. So supplement, don't substitute. And I think if we get that formula right and then start asking questions, what am I taking this for? What do I need some more of? I think there absolutely is a role for supplementation. And it's interesting that some sort of evidence-based contrarians argue against it, say we have no evidence. In fact, where we have the very best evidence of benefit from supplementation, we have turned it into fortification. So with fortification, we're basically saying this is a supplement you could take individually, but it's so important and so beneficial, we don't want to rely on you finding it for yourself. We're just going to put it in the food supply. And I mentioned examples earlier, folate, which is put in the grain supply and massively reduces the burden of neural tube defects, and iodine in table salt and many other examples. Vitamin D, of course, is put in many foods now. Just a quick digression. You can think of vitamin D as a supplement. Vitamin D is actually a hormone, and there are different versions of it. The active form is vitamin D3, 125 dihydroxycholecalciferol. It actually needs activation steps in both the liver and the kidney. It's a very, very interesting hormone. We are supposed to manufacture vitamin D in our skin with exposure to sunlight. But in modern living, where we're covered in clothes, and many of us live in climes where we're indoors for a good part of the year, we don't get enough sun exposure to make enough vitamin D to have the critical levels. So, as an alternative to that, you can take it in the form of a nutrient supplement. But essentially, what you're supplementing is a hormone that wasn't really supposed to be a nutrient in the first place, but you can get it that way. Critically important. So, yeah, clearly there's a role for supplementation. It just ought to be thoughtful.
If you don't mind me asking, what does Dr. David Katz's own personal supplement regimen look like, and how have you kind of decided what has or has not made the cut?
I eat a very optimal diet. And so, within the realm of what's plausible, I'm getting everything I can from food. But I've cut way back. I eat fish and seafood very rarely now. Not because I don't, I think eating fish, like wild salmon, I think it's good for me. I just don't think it's good for the salmon. And so, I'm kind of worried about the fisheries and the world supply of fish. And so I've cut way back and I'm very focused on sustainability. So I take an omega-3 supplement. And I think that, although you can get omega-3 in plants, mostly what you get in plants is ALA, or alpha linolenic acid. It's a short chain omega-3. Doesn't have the exact same metabolic effects as the long chain marine omega-3, DHA and EPA. And we can convert ALA into those long chain omega-3s, but we don't do it very efficiently. So I take a supplement of long chain omega-3s from algae. So it's sustainable and low on the food chain, but I take DHA and EPA. I take a probiotic. In adulthood, I started developing some sensitivities to tree nuts I didn't have as a kid. I really like eating tree nuts. And I find if I routinely take a good multi-strain probiotic, I don't have that problem. So it's obviously doing something to my microbiome that's helpful in that regard. So I take a probiotic. I take vitamin D. And I was prodded by a colleague to try creatine. I'm 62 and I'm very active and I work out routinely, but just because of my age, it's definitely harder than it used to be to maintain muscle mass. So I found that, harder to put on muscle, easier to lose it. It's kind of vexing. And I actually found that 5 grams of creatine a day makes a real difference there. So this is a shorter term commitment than the others that I've mentioned, but I'm taking creatine currently. And I definitely found it's improved my strength for workouts and my tolerance. And so that's kind of nice. And then selectively have to take B12 episodically because I'm mostly vegan, and most vegans are potentially subject to a B12 deficiency. So I periodically will check my level and take some supplementation there. But so it's exactly as I described, right? It's selective, it's thoughtful, it's about specifically what I need and why I need it.
So no multivitamin at your end. Who would you recommend considers a multivitamin?
You could argue almost anybody based on some of the long-term studies. They've suggested a potential cancer benefit, which I found really remarkable. And it may just be a statistical fluke, but it looked like it was the real thing, and a cognitive benefit. And I suspect the reason, though, is that the typical American diet is a pretty poor quality diet. And so, again, it's loaded up with the wrong kinds of fat, with added sugar and salt, but not nearly as rich in nutrients as one might like. And so the multivitamin may be ameliorating some of these nominal deficiencies and providing that insurance policy. I don't take one because I am supplementing the specific things I think I need. And in other areas, I know I'm doing really, really well. I have a very nutrient-rich diet. So I think anybody who has real reservations about their overall diet quality, I'd recommend they do what they have to do to improve their diet quality. But an easier step in the meantime would be to take a multivitamin. And again, it's not just vitamin. A multivitamin would be vitamins and minerals typically. But take a multi-nutrient supplement as an insurance policy against potential shortfalls in your diet. And the range of doses provided in most multis is such that it's safe. There's no particular worry about excess.
To finish here, David, to kind of close this episode out on another personal note, if you could give your 20-year-old self one piece of health advice, knowing what you know now, what would it be?
Wow, I'm not sure that. I mean, the thing that I would need to know as a young person is both that you're going to have to learn to say no, And you're going to have to learn to prioritize yourself. It's amazing how many people who are really dedicated to health promotion are killing themselves with the hours they work and the battles that we all fight to try and advance the human condition. But on the other hand, I'm not sure I would have benefited from hearing that as a young person because, I was ambitious and convinced I could make a difference. Mostly, Simon, this may sound odd, but mostly I go the other way. It's not so much that I wish the 20-year-old version of me knew stuff that I know now. I wish I didn't know what my 20-year-old self didn't know, because at 20, I really was convinced I could be the change I wanted to see in the world. And it's hard. It's really, really hard. And 40 years of effort, we could both look at all the things we've wanted to change and how slow change is and incremental. And then we take one step forward and two steps back. And as your career progresses across the years, the toll of that mounts up, and you start to wonder about your ability to make change. And it's a good thing to believe in our capacity to be the change we want to see in the world. And at 20, I believed I could change the world. I want that back. So I don't know. I think my 20-year-old self knew enough to do the things that I was trying to do back then. So I'd leave that guy alone for the most part and say, go for it. I can also say, wrap it up here. I was very focused on human health. And then over the course of my career, we entered this critical phase of planetary health concerns. So frankly, if I had it to do over again, I'd probably be focused preferentially on that because as I've noted a couple times in this conversation, I think planetary health is the signature issue of our time.
Well, if it means anything, I certainly have an enormous amount of faith in your ability to create change, and your contribution to this space has been nothing short of significant. So thank you very much for coming back and joining us and hanging out with me today. It's always such a pleasure. For people who want to keep up with your work and follow everything that you're doing, where's the best place for us to send them?
The central hub would be davidkatzmd.com. We have mentioned dietid.com, which is my particular work focus these days. And then I mentioned the True Health Initiative along the way in the conversation, truehealthinitiative.org. So those three are probably the best place to find out what I'm up to. And Simon, first of all, thank you for those kind words at the close. I'm going to keep trying and really enjoyed the conversation today.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.